What if the rules of a country were never meant to protect everyone equally? What if, from the very beginning, the laws of America were designed to favor some and exclude others? This isn't just a hidden detail in history. It's the foundation of American policy. In this video, we'll peel back the layers and uncover how racism shaped the very rules that built the nation. From slavery to segregation, from redlining to mass incarceration, policies have carried racism not as an accident, but as a feature. Stay with me until the end, because the reward is clarity. You'll see how decisions made long ago still shape the struggles of today. By the time we finish, you'll understand why inequality in America is not just a story of personal prejudice, but of laws written into the very system. To understand how racism shaped American policy, we have to start at the beginning. From the nation's earliest days, laws were written with race at their core. They were not neutral. They were not accidental. They were deliberate tools to create power for some and to deny it to others. Take the story of slavery. It wasn't only a social practice, it was legal policy. Enslaved Africans were defined by law not as people, but as property. This meant they had no rights, no protection, and no voice. Entire codes of law, known as slave codes, were written across the colonies. These rules dictated where enslaved people could go, what they could do, and even whether they could learn to read. A system of control wasn't just accepted, it was enforced by the state. At the same time, policies targeted indigenous people. The U.S. government didn't just take land, it passed laws that stripped native nations of their rights to territory. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 is one example. Under this law, native people were forced off their ancestral lands to make way for white settlers. This wasn't random violence. It was state-approved displacement carried out under the banner of policy. Even citizenship itself was racialized from the start. The Naturalization Act of 1790 limited citizenship only to free white persons. Think about that. At the very foundation of the American Republic, the government legally decided who counted as a full member of society and who never would. Black people, indigenous people, and later Asian immigrants were excluded from the very definition of belonging. These early laws set the tone. They created a racial hierarchy where whiteness was rewarded with freedom, land, and citizenship, and others were locked out. America didn't stumble into racism, it wrote it into its rulebook. And here's the crucial point. Once policy creates inequality, that inequality doesn't disappear when a law changes. It lingers. It builds. The wealth, power, and privileges secured for some at the start became the foundation for generations to come. The end of slavery in 1865 should have been the beginning of freedom. But freedom on paper did not mean freedom in reality. Almost immediately, new laws and policies were created to maintain control over black people and to keep racial inequality alive. During Reconstruction, there was a brief moment of hope. Formerly enslaved people voted, held office, and built schools. But that progress was short-lived. White lawmakers in the South fought back with a new system of laws called the Black Codes. These laws restricted where black people could live, how they worked, and even who they could associate with. The goal was clear: keep them tied to cheap labor and strip them of true independence. As Reconstruction ended, Jim Crow laws rose in its place. These laws made segregation official. They forced black and white people into separate schools, buses, restaurants, and even drinking fountains. This wasn't just social custom, it was state policy. Breaking these laws often meant fines, arrests, or violence. Segregation wasn't about separate but equal. It was about ensuring that black communities had fewer resources, fewer rights, and fewer opportunities. But the reach of racist policy didn't stop at public spaces. Voting was targeted too. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses were all designed to make it nearly impossible for black citizens to vote. On top of that, intimidation and violence were used to scare people away from the polls. Once again, policy and power worked hand in hand to silence voices and preserve white dominance. Even outside the South, the same logic spread. Northern cities created zoning laws and housing restrictions that forced black families into specific neighborhoods. Job discrimination was written into hiring practices. The message was the same everywhere. Freedom would exist only in name, while laws would ensure inequality remained a reality. This period shows us something important. Racism in America didn't fade with the end of slavery. It adapted. It put on a new mask. Instead of chains, it became laws. Instead of auctions, it became segregated schools and stolen votes. The system reinvented itself to maintain the same unequal power. By the 20th century, racism in American policy had changed form. It no longer always announced itself in blunt language like black codes or Jim Crow. Instead, it often hid behind words that sounded neutral. But the impact was anything but neutral. One of the clearest examples was immigration law. In 1924, the Immigration Act set strict quotas on who could enter the country. The quotas heavily favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, while sharply restricting people from Asia, Africa, while parts of Eastern Europe. On paper, it looked like a simple numbers game. In reality, it was a way to preserve America as a white nation. The law didn't say we don't want non-white people, but that was exactly what it meant. Housing policy told a similar story. The practice of redlining began in the 1930s, when government-backed agencies drew maps of cities, marking some neighborhoods as risky for investment. The deciding factor wasn't the quality of the homes or the people's income. It was race. If black families lived there, the neighborhood was colored red on the map, meaning banks would refuse loans. This single policy decision locked generations of black families out of home ownership, the most common way to build wealth in America. Meanwhile, white families were encouraged to buy homes in safe neighborhoods, passing down property and security to their children. Even the criminal justice system followed the same pattern. Laws written to look colorblind were enforced in ways that targeted black communities. Policing became harsher in black neighborhoods, and sentencing laws punished them more severely. These weren't just individual acts of bias. They were the results of policies designed to create a certain outcome, control and containment of minority communities. What's important to see here is the shift. By the 20th century, racism didn't always shout. It whispered. It dressed itself up in professional terms like zoning, standards, or public safety. But the results were clear. White Americans gained more access to opportunity, while others were systematically denied it. This is why racism in policy is so powerful. It doesn't always need ugly language to do its work. Sometimes it hides behind neutral words while producing deeply unequal realities. As America moved into the late 20th century and beyond, many openly racist laws disappeared. But racism in policy didn't end. It evolved. Old ideas were dressed in new language, and their effects continued to shape daily life. One of the most striking examples is the war on drugs. Beginning in the 1970s and intensifying in the 1980s, this policy was presented as a way to fight crime and addiction. On the surface, it sounded neutral, but in practice, it hit Black and Latino communities the hardest. Harsh sentencing laws punish crack cocaine far more severely than powder cocaine, even though they were chemically similar. Crack was more common in poor Black neighborhoods, while powder was linked to wealthier white users. The result was a massive rise in incarceration rates for Black Americans, tearing families apart and leaving long-term scars on communities. Mass incarceration itself became a modern form of control. Policies such as 3 strikes laws and mandatory minimum sentences put millions of people, disproportionately people of color, behind bars. Prisons filled, and entire generations were marked by a criminal record. What slavery and Jim Crow once did through chains and segregation, modern policy carried out through cages and sentences. But the problem doesn't stop with the justice system. Education policies still reflect deep racial divides. Schools in wealthy, mostly white areas receive far more funding, while schools in Black and Latino neighborhoods often struggle with fewer resources, larger class sizes, while aging buildings. Healthcare shows the same story. Policies tied to jobs and wealth leave many minority families without proper access, creating gaps in life expectancy and health outcomes. Even voting rights remain contested. New voter ID laws, cuts to early voting, and limits on mail-in ballots may look like neutral reforms. But in practice, they disproportionately affect communities of color. The echoes of Jim Crow are still present, just hidden in modern clothing. These modern policies prove a key truth. Racism doesn't always fade away. It adapts. It finds new forms. And it continues to shape who has access to power, opportunity, and security in America. It's easy to think of racism as something buried in the past, locked away in old history books. But the truth is the policies built centuries ago still shape the world we live in today. The decisions made by lawmakers long before us created systems that ripple through every generation. Take wealth, for example. Because of slavery, segregation, and redlining, Black families were denied the chance to build assets for hundreds of years. Even today, the racial wealth gap is staggering. The average white family has far more wealth than the average Black or Latino family. This isn't just the result of hard work or personal choices. It's the legacy of policy. The same is true in health. Communities that were redlined often ended up near highways, factories, or neglected infrastructure. Today, those same neighborhoods face higher rates of asthma, shorter life expectancies, and limited access to hospitals. What looks like bad luck is actually the outcome of laws and zoning decisions made decades ago. Education tells a similar story. Because schools are funded largely by local property taxes, wealthy neighborhoods with higher home values get stronger schools. Poorer areas, often Black and Latino, get less funding. This isn't an accident. It's the modern echo of policies that once drew red lines across maps and said, this community doesn't deserve investment. And then there's democracy itself. The right to vote has been attacked again and again, from Jim Crow restrictions to modern voter suppression laws. Every new barrier to the ballot box reminds us that access to political power has always been racialized in America. So why does all of this matter today? Because systemic inequality isn't about isolated events or individual prejudice. It's about structures that were built over centuries and still stand. If we don't understand the roots, we can't address the branches. Without looking back, we'll never understand why things look the way they do now. The racist foundations of American policy are not just a story of the past. They are the blueprint of the present. America likes to tell a story of progress, a story where freedom and equality expand with each generation. But when we look closely, another truth emerges. Racism was not a side effect of American policy. It was its foundation. From slavery to Jim Crow, from redlining to mass incarceration, the system was built to serve some while shutting out others. The echoes of those decisions are still with us. They shape wealth. They shape schools. They shape neighborhoods, health, and even the right to vote. None of this is coincidence. It is the result of choices made, written into law, and enforced through power. So the real question is, where do we go from here? Will the future repeat the same patterns, with racism hiding in new policies that look neutral on paper but aren't in practice? Or will we finally confront the roots, not just the branches, of inequality? Understanding this history is not about guilt. It's about clarity. It's about seeing the system for what it is, and realizing that change requires more than words. It requires rewriting the rules so they protect everyone equally, not just some. American policy was built on racial lines, but the future isn't written yet. The question is, who will it be written for?